Trust. The purpose of the Environmental Speaker Series is to bring members from our community together to learn about the natural world and the people who study it, learn from it, and protect it. This series is offered for free as a benefit to our community, but we do welcome donations to help support this and other programs offered by the Ventura Land Trust. The suggested donation is $10. You can contribute through the donation box outside at the table where you checked in, or by going online to venturalandtrust.org. For those of you in the back, if you want to sit down, come on in and join us. Before we get started with tonight's program, I want to provide a quick update on the status of our preserves. As you may know, the Upper Canyon at Harmon Canyon suffered major damage earlier this year and will remain closed for the foreseeable future until the road can be repaired. The lower Harmon Canyon has been open, but with the rain coming, likely to close again. So be patient. We will reopen on that shortly. Follow us on social media and make sure you join our mailing list to receive updates about those status of those Harmon Canyon. On the river preserves, Big Rock and Willoughby, they continue to recover from 2 really big wet winters. The biggest challenge that we're facing there is the reintroduction of arundo to those preserves. That's unfunded work that must occur. We can't just turn a blind eye to it so that arundo doesn't get a foothold again. So if you're interested in supporting that work, of course, we always welcome donations and volunteers to help us with that effort. Lastly, Mariano Rancho is still currently on schedule to open to the public in 2025. On to tonight's program. We're excited to welcome Joseph Brandt to learn about his work with the endangered California condor. Joseph has spent much of his career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service working to recover the iconic California condor. He joined the California Condor Recovery Program as a volunteer intern in 2005. Since then, he has worked studying and protecting the condor, ensuring that North America's largest and one of the world's most endangered birds would be around for future generations. He is currently an assistant field supervisor at the Ventura Fish and Wildlife Office, where he leads a team of biologists who protect a variety of endangered species in Ventura, Santa Barbara, and San Luis Obispo counties. He is also a member of Ventura Land Trust's Advisory Council, as we have a couple other advisory council members in the house tonight. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Joseph.
Thank you, Melissa. All right, well, welcome everybody. I don't think I need to introduce myself, but I'm going to share my time working on the California Condor Recovery Program. Most of that time was spent here in sort of based out of Ventura counties, although as you'll learn, condors have really, really large home ranges. So the condors that are here, in the Ventura and Santa Barbara backcountry are also condors that are, flying up, as far north as like Yosemite in the Sierras. So we'll get into that. But yeah, so before we sort of get into the work that we did, I thought it was probably a good idea to sort of introduce you to condors because they're really, really an incredible species. Wait. Back up. Okay, so condors are a part of the Cathartidae family. That's the New World vultures. They may not be the most handsome of the New World vultures, but I think they're probably one of the most expressive. Folks sort of initially see condors and other vultures and think they're a bit ghoulish, but I sort of see condors and find them to be like just incredibly expressive creatures. So they just communicate a lot through expression. They don't have vocal cords, they don't sing a song, so much of the way that they communicate with one another is through looks and through expressions. And so there's lots of just little nuances and things going on. And that's sort of in part why their heads are bald and sort of, they've got various colors and shades. And those colors and shades within that head can sort of become more vibrant and less vibrant. They don't really change colors, but as they blush or get, sort of want to express something. And so they really are just like incredible creatures. Like just, you sort of look at them and you can just sort of see that there's something just sort of, there's wheels spinning. And, I've had the opportunity to be around condors for well over a decade or a decade and a half. And you just notice that, like, when handling other birds, they sort of go into this kind of comatose. Some of that is through stress and whatnot. Handling condors, when you're holding them, you're looking at them and they're looking back at you, and there's sort of things going on. Another sort of example of that, there's a condor at the Los Angeles Zoo named Dolly, and Dolly fell from a wild nest. She injured her wing and is not flighted. So the zoo has kept Dolly captive, but as an ambassador bird. So they really sort of tried to tame Dolly and make her sort of as most pet-like as you want. And lo and behold, condors would make incredible pets. They're incredibly intelligent birds. They think about things going on. They recognize individuals. Dolly has keepers at the zoo that she really likes and keepers at the zoo that she really despises. Mostly that's sort of good parent, bad parent situation. Sometimes you have to play that role of like, the disciplinarian. And those are the keepers that she's not, super fans of. But at the same time, it's just, I think, really sort of it demonstrates how condors are just incredibly expressive and incredibly intelligent. And so hopefully you guys can kind of see past that ghoulishness and really see condors for these animated and intelligent creatures that they are. Okay, so condors also are one of the largest birds in North America. So they have a 9.5 to 10 foot wingspan. So, just to put that into perspective, I'm 6'4", I'm a pretty tall guy, 6 foot wingspan, add another 3 to 4 feet. So me and a half is the wingspan of a condor. That's about as wide as a school bus. So if they were standing in the middle of the school bus, they could touch either window standing inside. Not the length, but the width. They weigh about 17 to 22 pounds. They stand, yay height, about 3 feet or so. And that size, people sort of think of the condors as being this creature from a different era, right? A part of the megafauna. They fed on mammoths and woolly rhinoceros and creatures that have long gone extinct. Yes, that's sort of a part of it, but condor's size is actually an adaptation for two things that currently are meaningful to them. One, with those great big wings, they can soar incredibly efficiently, and then their size. Condors are scavengers, so when they come up to a carcass and they're ready to eat, that size is an advantage for them because any of the other birds around really sort of have to move out of the way, with the exception of maybe golden eagles. But at times in the sort of the world of sort of condor or scavenging WrestleMania, I've seen condors sort of win out the battles with even against the golden eagles, which are also incredibly powerful animals with their gnarly talons. Condors are also really long-lived. They live, we think, about 60 years. The oldest condor that we know the age of is 52 now, which is 7 years older than I am. It's kind of crazy to think about. And so there are likely condors that are well older than that in captivity. The oldest condor in the wild is a bird that was that was hatched, I think is maybe a year older than me, so it's probably about 46 years old. Just a couple other pictures to sort of show size comparisons of condors. There's a pointer here. Green light. Anyways, the picture on the right is a condor, and that's a peregrine falcon next to it. So people sort of see falcons as the fastest bird in the world, the fastest animal in the world. And they're like, oh, that's a pretty big, impressive bird. Condors make the falcon look like a sparrow. And then turkey vultures, which are often confused for condors. People see turkey vultures and they're like, I saw this huge bird. And it's got to be a condor. And almost inevitably, especially down and around and in town, it's a turkey vulture. And you can sort of see the size comparison between turkey vultures, that's the guy lower holding its wings out, and the condor. Condors are twice, 3 times the size of a turkey vulture, so much, much bigger. Like I said, condors use that great big wingspan for flight. Like turkey vultures and other raptors, they soar. So meaning that they don't really flap their wings very often. They use air currents to keep them aloft, much like hang gliders or paragliders. So they use sort of 2 types of lift to do that. One is thermal, so the sun rises, it heats up cool air in the canyon, and that air rises. So condors use that rising air. Or they use what's called orographic lift, which is vertical air hitting mountainous terrains and then being pushed upwards from the mountains. So condors will use both of that flight, and sort of seasonally, they use those air currents differently. So in the winter, they're relying more often on that orographic flight, so that uplift from vertical, from sort of mountains. And they tend to have smaller ranges in the wintertime as a result of that. And then in the spring and the summer, we see condors' ranges really starting to expand. And that's because that thermal energy is starting to be more powerful. And so they can start traveling great distances. Both thermal and orographic lift means that condors tend to spend their time in mountainous terrain. So they don't really get out into the flats. So some areas they'll fly over, the Salinas Valley, condors will fly back and forth over that. But condors typically won't fly over the Central Valley, although we have a couple of instances where we've seen condors actually make the jump from the Santa Lucia range across to the Southern Sierras. So condors soar, and so that soaring, and this is sort of plays into a bit of their size too, but that soaring is sort of a way that condors find their food. So they can move across the landscape really efficiently, not spending a lot of energy getting around because they're relying on that those air currents. And so they're flying and they're sort of searching for food, but they're also not just searching for the food that's beneath them. They're sort of reading the horizon. So if you think of condors spread out across the landscape, it's sort of a network of individuals that all can indicate that there's food for one another. So what vultures often do is, like, when they find food, they start circling over it. And so if you're a condor, and let's just say I'm a condor and I'm 10 miles away from the next condor, and I start seeing that condor start to circle, that's an indication to me that there might be something over there I want to eat at, or a meal that I want to partake in. And especially when they start seeing condors drop from the flight down to the ground, that's like a dinner bell. So condors are using each other as a way to find food. They will also use other scavengers and other animal activity to find food. So one of the things when they're flying around looking for activity, they will often, if there's sort of a group of activity, a group of people even, they might get curious and go check things out. So that sort of lends into some of that intelligence that condors has, is that they're reading environmental cues to try to find food. And so, again, another sort of just picture of condors across the landscape, mountainous terrain. And so the more condors out there, the better chances they have at finding food. And condors also have incredibly good eyesight. So Well, they might be flying over this mountain range. This is in the just north of Fillmore, and that's the Santa Susanas in the background and Santa Monica Mountains in the very far background. But they might see condors on those opposing mountain ranges with that incredible eyesight, start to circle, and then beeline it there. So the more condors you have out on the landscape, the better off you are. And so like in this photo, we've got 22 condors. This photo was actually taken at the Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge. It's one of the refuges that I work at, and I'll sort of talk about later. I also want to just point out, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, 22 is the lowest number that the condor population was in the wild. And so at one time, there was 23 condors in the world. One of those was actually that oldest condor that's in captivity, and then 22 in the wild. And so that was as low as condor numbers got. But I'll get into that a little bit later. I want to sort of continue on talking about condors. Holy smokes. So condors will soar around, and so ultimately when they're using that network, it means that they're probably going to be feeding in groups. And so when condors come together, they first wait. They're a big bird. They've got gangly wings. It's sort of a vulnerable space to be on the ground, right? So it's just, to get up into flight it takes a little effort. So when condors come and find a carcass, they will sit and they will wait, and they will sort of wait out to make sure that whatever killed that carcass isn't still hanging around. And so eventually, condors will come in and start to feed. And so here they're feeding on an elk carcass. This is up in the Tehachapi Mountains. This, oftentimes it's sort of these guys. So condors, the older birds have so they're fully colored heads, and these darker headed birds mean that they're younger. So they haven't reached maturity yet, which takes about 6 to 7 years. But these younger birds typically are lower on the totem pole, and so they're a little more willing to take risks. So oftentimes it's the younger birds that will sort of move in and start feeding. And then once the older birds sort of realize that those younger birds aren't in danger, then they move in and start to bully the younger birds out of the way. And so there really is this pronounced dominance hierarchy amongst condors. Like there are dominant birds and lesser dominant birds, and when you see them at a feeding site like this, it can be incredibly dynamic, but there's almost always one condor that sort of, when it arrives, all the other birds step back and let that bird feed. So that gets into like how the birds select their mates and stuff is related to that hierarchy. Condors are part of nature's cleanup crew as scavengers. And so this is sort of a series of photos to show how just efficient they are. I'm just going to make note of the time. It's 12:48, so it's just afternoon, just a little late lunch. So this is a carcass that we put out on one of our refuges. So condors, after about 9 minutes, 30 condors have arrived on site, and they go to town. And so you get these just incredibly, lots of condors coming in and moving. And so, because that being on the ground is vulnerable, they're going to be as efficient as possible. So they will gobble down the carcasses as quickly as they can. Yeah, and so in about 90 minutes, those 13 condors took which was probably, I think there were two, probably 30 to 40 pound carcasses down to skin and bone. And so condors will do this with pretty much anything dead they can find. We've seen condors up in Big Sur feeding on whales and sea lions. We've even found condor footprints around a sea otter carcass. In inland, cattle, horses, domestic livestock, also domestic ungulates, elk, and deer, wild hogs, so feral pigs, and then also we think of sort of big food items, but they will also key in on ground squirrels. They'll key in on. We've seen them feeding on dead raccoons as roadkill. Pets that people have dumped off the side of the road that were dead, a bit morbid, but even people, people who have, sort of ended their life and in certain ways, and then condors were the first to find them. So they rely on death to make their living, right? So they really rely on death to make their living, which sort of puts them at the tippy top of the food chain, right? So even past predators, condors are sort of the ones that come in and clean up even after the predator. Feeding in groups and having that dynamic really means that condors are incredibly social. So they spend a lot of time hanging out with one another. And so that's sort of maybe the other place where that condor intelligence really shines through. So they come in, they're very interactive with one another. They will often sort of always be sort of vying for that dominance, who gets the top perch. Here you'll have one bird come in, and then a more dominant bird comes in and bounces that bird down to a lower spot. And you see this just sort of dynamic sort of social structure in condors. A lot of the zookeepers that I've had the chance to work with, they really talk about condors much more like primates than like other birds. And that's because of that social structure. They're really easy to anthropomorphize. There's a lot of traits because they're so social that I think people can relate to, because we're also a social species. And with all of that sort of social work, condors can also be sort of problematic if they're being social in places that you don't want them. Up in the Tehachapis, this made national news. We had condors visiting homes near Bear Valley Springs. And Bear Valley Springs is a beautiful community, really built right smack dab center in like ideal condor roosting habitat. And so condors were coming in and roosting in some of the trees around and in around the area. And they don't really know the difference between the peak of a house and a tree, so they'd end up on people's houses. But being sort of curious and a bit of troublemakers, then they'd sort of perch down on the house and start looking at people through people's windows, right? And then they would start nibbling on the window insulation, and then knocking plants and things over. And became really a problem. The people in Bear Valley Springs, I'm super grateful. They were really excited to see condors. Maybe a little too excited. There's probably examples of people putting food out or water out for condors, and boy, were they sorry. So we worked with this community to sort of say, look, condors, you think of them more like bears or raccoons with wings, and much less like this incredible endangered bird, like the hummingbird. You don't put out a condor feeder, right? You're not trying to put carcasses or steaks or whatever out for condors to eat, because they're going to come and cause problems. And another thing about condors with all of that social is they really work to sort of figure out who their mates are going to be. And so all of these are sort of examples of condor mating. The males tend to do this dance where they sort of hold their wings out and wobble back and forth, and eventually they sort of get the female sort of cupped in and gets her attention, and next thing you know, the male standing on the female's back, and I don't know if there's any kids around, but there's they're copulating and working on producing an egg. And so that mating can happen. So this mating typically, or the breeding season with all of the sort of the courtship and mating, typically starts around November. So it started, back last fall, and then condors will form pair bonds. I like to say condors have long-term pair bonds. I think in the history of humans and biology, we like to say, oh, condors they're mate for life. Well, humans probably would be considered mates for life too, but we all know that there's divorce and breakups and cheating. Same with condors. We've seen divorces. We've seen out of pair copulations. But the big thing is they do work as a pair and sometimes as a trio to care for their offspring. And so they nest in these really incredible canyon country or the old growth of Monterey redwood forests. Here's a condor nesting in a coastal redwood. Also up in the sequoias, they've nested in giant sequoias. But mostly around here, they're using sandstone cliffs and caves. So they pick those because it's it's harder for predators to get access to. So it's a sort of a safe place to rear their egg or their chicks. And so once they've selected a nest, it's usually the female that does it. The pairs will sort of search around, explore a variety of nests all within the same general area. And then when the female is ready to lay her egg, she goes and lays. And then the male, who might not be there right there when she lays, has to go in and start searching all the various cavities that they explore together to find the female. And then he usually takes the first bout. After that, like he's pretty eager to sit on the egg and share that responsibility. The egg takes about 2 months to hatch. And then, so they're incubating that egg, sharing responsibilities, usually trading off every 2 to 3 days. And then the egg hatches and you end up with this little sort of bobble-headed fluff ball that's really going to be relying on its parents for the next 6 months. And so over time, that chick starts to grow. That's about a 30-day-old chick. These two are probably 60 days old. But eventually, in 6 months, it grows to about the size of a full-grown condor. So it's going to grow really, really rapidly. And so once it's a full-grown condor, the chick has fledged and left the nest, but it will continue to rely on its parent for upwards of a year after it's left the nest. And that's pretty unique. Not many other bird species rely on their parents for that long. What that means is... Not yet. Here we go. So what that means is condors are sort of referred to as a K-selected species, or sort of this type 1 survival curve. Meaning that they're very long-lived and really high survivorship, but they are really slow to reproduce. They don't produce a lot of individuals very rapidly. The opposite of that would sort of be like a mosquito or something like that, where they have lots and lots of larvae and offspring, but not many of them make it to the point of reproduction. So that natural history trait worked against condors, because species that have this amount of this sort of life history, or this sort of survivorship curve, does not do very well with any amount of mortality. So anything that's really tips that scale and starts causing mortality means that the population will begin to decline, and decline incredibly rapidly. And so that's when humans started really paying attention to the condors, which was probably the 1930s. We sort of, the first biologists or naturalists started really doing systematic studies of condors. The condor population was in decline. So for comparison, all of those other vulture species that I showed, New World vultures, they have populations well into the thousands. So probably more like tens of thousands. The Andean condor, which is the condor's closest relative, there's probably about 10,000 individuals of Andean condors in South America. And so condors were truly at the brink of extinction. Here, they might have been in an extinction vortex, meaning that without anything done, they still weren't going to survive, because there just weren't enough of them to maintain that population and grow it back from any sort of stochastic event that could just cause the population to just be done. So we found, really, we didn't begin to really pay attention to condors until they were incredibly rare. And so in the 1980s, the condor population dropped down to the sort of 30, 20, or high 20s, low 30s. And then the biologists studying the condors at the time found like a series of deaths that occurred sort of almost sequentially within the same season. And that brought the population down to about up to that 22 individuals. And that really is what began a Herculean effort by humans to save the condors from extinction. So the first thing that people did was we trapped all the condors. We went out and we trapped all remaining condors. And this was an incredibly controversial decision to make. But we brought them all into captivity, and that captivity, it was sort of always meant to be like protective custody for the condors, right? So we are going to ensure that those remaining condors survive. We're going to pair them together into pairs, and we're going to start breeding them. And we're going to use some traits about the condor's biology to start breeding them even more quickly than they could in the wild. And one of the ways in which they did that is you can get a condor pair to lay 2 or 3 eggs. Typically, they only lay 1. But if you catch them early enough in the season, when they have that egg, you can take that egg away, and the pair will recycle. It will say, oh, our egg failed. We'll go back into breeding mode, and they'll lay another egg. And so you can get 2 or 3 eggs out of one pair of condors, and then you can incubate them. This is an old Peterson's incubator. I think they're still in use at the Los Angeles Zoo. And then while the pair will raise one of those chicks, you can use a puppet to raise the others, right? And so the reason why you want to use a puppet is because you don't want condors to imprint on humans, because they are incredibly imprintable. And condors, with that intelligence and that curiosity, it gets a little tricky to have a condor that's not afraid of people and that might seek people out for food. We sort of already talked about like condors visiting humans even when they're not looking necessarily for food to begin with. Just by proximity, they can be problematic. So condors out in the world where they actually seek people out, not really good. And so with that effort, really we sort of started the California Condor Recovery Program. And so that program consists of a lot of partners, right? So there are several captive breeding programs where, the San Diego Safari Park, Los Angeles Zoo, Oregon Zoo, Chapultepec Zoo down in Mexico City. Those areas, and actually the World Center for Birds of Prey by the Peregrine Fund, they were sort of where those remaining condors were kept. And so they started breeding them. And so as the numbers of condors started bolstering up, we started releasing condors into the wild. And then once we sort of had condors out into the wild, we started monitoring them. We realized, like, geez, condors, we need to help condors by teaching people how to sort of interact and be around condors, and teaching people how they can help condors in that. Primarily, that became an issue that I'm going to talk about with non-lead outreach. But we also have other federal agencies, other tribal partners, lots of state agencies, academic partnerships. All of this sort of put together is the effort to recover condors back into the wild. So I just want to sort of acknowledge this is a multi-state international program. And so the results of that, I don't have that many graphs, but I do have a few. The results of that, so here's that sort of decline, has meant condor populations are greater than we've ever seen, right? That in really probably since the 1600s, somewhere in there, that we at least know of, that we are sure that there were condors in that great of number. But we far surpassed the condors that were, documented in the 30s and the 40s, the numbers of condors out there. And so, this graph just sort of shows, we basically built up a captive population. That's sort of the purple portion of this population graph are the captive condors. Then once we had enough captive condors in 1992, we started releasing condors into the wild. And so now you have this reintroduced condors. And then in 2001, 2004, I believe, condors began reproducing in the wild. And so this orange slice on the top are the condors that this captive released population have produced in the wild. So captives, captive released, and the wild fledged individuals. So today's population, we have about 506 or 561 condors. Actually, we don't have about, we have 561 condors in the world, at least at the end of 2023. That's actually down 3 condors from the previous year. The wild population is 344. That population is split between 2 flocks in California, or 3 flocks in California. Forgive me, the Northern California flock is sort of new for me. But 2 in southern, 2 that have been long established. 1 in Southern California, that's sort of our area, and then 1 sort of in the Big Sur, San Benito County region, and that's the Central California flock. So that's here. And then the flock of condors that inhabits sort of southern Utah and northern Arizona, released just north of the Grand Canyon. A population of condors in San Pedro Martir in Baja California, Mexico. And then the most recent population, the Yurok tribe and Redwood National Parks have started releasing condors up in Northern California. And so they've only got about 11, they've got, I think, 11 condors total, yeah. So I've been working on condors in this area. So this is where I spent my time. So we'll quickly go through just what I've done to sort of what my time with the Condor program really involved. Again, the southern flock did very similar to that, but here's the time that I was working as one of the biologists within the Condor program. So in that population, we identified a number of threats, and then we did a number of activities to try to mitigate those threats to achieve those goals. And so I'm going to, sure. So what are those threats? So the threats are sort of the known, so what we know condors. So one of the things that population being in decline, we didn't really know that condors were what was causing the decline when we brought them into captivity. There were just too few of them to truly understand what was going on. And so one of the big parts of our program now, when we started reintroducing condors, is to figure out what they're dying from. And so notice there's one really big aspect of the condor program that they're dying from, and that's lead toxicosis, which I'll get into and talk about here in a bit. And then there are sort of a range of other things that are also killing condors. Predation, mostly that's pretty natural. We see that happening in young condor populations. Disease actually used to be not anywhere near this size, this portion of death. Unfortunately, this last year, highly pathogenic avian influenza infected the condor population in Arizona and southern Utah, and they lost, I believe, about 20 condors within like only a few month period. Power lines, wildfires, shooting, and then down to a sort of a litany of other things. But really, lead poisoning is the biggest problem for condors. So I'm going to talk about that now. Do want to point out there are also other threats on the horizon, and some of the things that aren't things that kill condors, right? They might affect the reproduction, like the ingestion of microtrash or eggshell thinning caused from DDT, from eating contaminated marine mammals. Wind energy is a concern for condors. It's one that I think on the regulatory side we're sort of getting ahead of and preventing condors from being taken any great numbers by wind energy. And then, of course, sort of habitat change, right? So, all of this at one time was areas that condors might search for food in, and now it's the San Fernando Valley, I believe. So lead poisoning. Just to talk about lead poisoning, condors are scavengers, so they're going to sort of feed on dead things. And one of the dead things they feed on are hunter-shot carcasses. And so, I'm going to photo you through this, but when hunters use lead ammunition, that lead ammunition, one of the things that hunters want from a bullet is for that bullet to expand to cause a hydrostatic shock in the animal that they're shooting to kill the animal quickly. When lead expands, it leaves behind fragments. Lead, it leaves behind lots of lead particulate, sort of the nature of the metal. And so, this is a deer that was shot through the neck with a lead bullet. And you can sort of see once the wound channel goes from about here through about there. And so once the bullet hits the tissue, it starts to fragment. And you can see these highly radiopaque little dots. So those are all lead fragments. And so if that hunter doesn't recover this carcass and it's left in the field, now a condor is going to come in and start feeding on it. And condors, they have big, powerful beaks, but they're also going to look for the easiest way to get into that carcass. And so that's often, the mouth, the eyeballs, the anus, or a wound channel, right? Those are really the ways in which they're going to, get in and start getting at that meat. And so when condors start going in and feeding on the wound channel, all of this lead particulate is going to be gobbled down completely unknowingly. It's not like condors are chewing on their food, right? They're just swallowing it whole. And so as a part of the Condor field program, biologists go out and trap condors twice a year, and they monitor their condor blood for lead. So we trap them in these large flight pens, we handle them, and we take a blood sample, and we give the condor an exam. And so the blood, we can do a lead test. It's the same sort of blood test that we give children to detect the level of lead in their blood. And through a combination of blood lead level and also, sort of visible symptoms, we can determine if a condor is suspected to be lead poisoned and sick. And so those condors that are sick are taken to one of the captive facilities. They have the most they are the most capable of dealing with sort of health issues or medical issues for condors. And so those condors are then treated. They're radiographed, and we can actually often find that condors have lead fragments in their digestive tract. So this is actually a radiograph of a condor, and those same sort of opaque fragments are found in the stomach of the condor. And so lead poisoning is a terrible, terrible way to die. It's a neurotoxin. It causes paralysis. And most often in condors, what it does is it paralyzes the condor's ability to move food through its system. So a condor will start eating and ingesting, and it ends up with lots of food in its crop and in its stomach, and it's just unable to digest any of that food. So that dead, rotting meat starts to fester inside of the animal and becomes this massive infection. So not only do the keepers at the zoo and the veterinary staff are they treating the lead in the condor's blood through chelation therapy, they also need to purge all of purge the poison, but purge all of the food that the condor can't digest out of the system, because condors, like many birds, have incredible digestive systems, and so they can really get through a lot of stuff. But when that doesn't happen, it's just this incredibly you oftentimes when you get a condor that's sick from lead, it stinks like death. Like condors typically don't stink like death, even though they eat carcasses. They have a musky aroma, but not one that's like the smell of death. And when a condor is sick from lead poisoning, it is putrid. It has a really, really rotten smell. And so they have to get that, and it's also hot to the touch, like their crop and their stomach. It's just a massive infection. It's like if you imagine an abscess the size of a volleyball, because you've eaten a bunch of meat and it's just rotting inside of you instead of being digested. So really, really no fun. Oftentimes when we find condors that are sick and they're often really low, even though they have great big, full stomachs and great big crops, they often are, 2/3 their weight or half their weight, weighing like 12 to 13 pounds. And so, it's a really, really terrible way to die. Like they're eating but starving. It's just no fun. So we can treat condors at the zoos, and the folks at the zoo and the field programs is that we've gotten really good at that. In fact, we've sort of refined down to figure out which condors are really in need of treatment, so that we're not giving chelation to birds that don't need it. So we've really sort of refined that down, and we've got that down to a science, but that doesn't really solve the problem, right? There's still lead on the landscape, and our goal is to sort of step away and let condors sort of do their thing without having to be treated for lead poisoning. So, the ultimate solution is working with the hunting and ranching community to transition from lead ammunition to non-lead ammunition. And so this ends up being a big, big part of the Condor program as well, is going out and doing sort of outreach and interacting with the hunting and ranching communities. And people will sometimes, and I think wrongfully, sort of see hunters as the problem. And I think more correctly is looking at hunters as the solution, right? So the problem is lead. Hunters being out in the landscape and shooting animals is actually providing a food source for condors. We know that. They feed on that food source and they get lead poisoning. So if hunters change the ammunition from a lead bullet to a non-lead bullet, now they're providing a clean food source for condors, which is really important. It's really important to know that condors have enough on the landscape to eat. And they rely on predators, humans being one of them, to provide that food source. And so, that's really the approach that we're taking is, going out. There's organizations like the Ventana Wildlife Society going out and actually distributing boxes of non-lead ammunition to the hunting and ranching community so that they use that ammo instead of lead ammo. Going out and doing shooting, like letting hunters go out and try non-lead ammunition so they can shoot and sort of get used to the change, because ballistically it does change. You have to, when you're shooting a rifle, you have to really dial your rifle in to the type of ammunition that you're using. So a change is not just a trivial thing. I can't just be like, hey, take this and then go shoot your deer. Like you need to be able to be sure that you're going to, shoot accurately so that you can kill that animal as quickly as possible. And so there's a variety of organizations, some, the state Fish and Game, or, Department of Fish and Wildlife Service, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, that's an old logo of the Fish and Game, Arizona Fish and Game, Utah Fish and Game, but also other nonprofits. Institute for Wildlife Studies helps. They did a lot of work on the Channel Islands removing pigs. So they sort of have a credible group of hunters that can speak to this issue really well. The North American Non-Lead Partnership, again, a hunter-focused group, founded by the Peregrine Fund, but really honed in on getting hunters to sort of do outreach to other hunters to identify this as an issue. And hunters have a long history of being conservationists, right? So the open space that condors use and need is the same open space that hunters desire to go out and shoot game. So there really is common ground. The other way that we deal with the threats, right, is we're maintaining the population by releasing condors into captivity. And so the way that we do that is the zoos will produce about 40 to 50 condors every year, and then they're distributed by genetics out to the field programs. And then the field programs will hold these birds in flight pens, and then we release them every year. So we release about a cohort of 5 to 10 condors into the wild every year at most of the wild, where those wild populations are. Those cohorts, when they're kept in the flight pen, are usually kept with an older bird to sort of act as a mentor, so they can begin to sort of become accustomed to being a condor in the wild. Like I said, there's all of that social dynamic. These birds are sort of oblivious to, so letting some of them out into that fray without that, sometimes they get bullied. They might actually really isolate themselves from the population, and condors really rely on one another to find food and do things. So we're trying to do everything we can to encourage sort of that in social interaction and that social engagement. Another aspect of condors, sort of how to benefit the population and also to deal with one of the threats that's related to reproduction is a nest management program. So the biologists that work out in the field also will go into condor nests during the breeding season to check on egg fertility and also to handle and tag the chicks so that we can begin to monitor them as soon as they leave their nests. The big issue here was Condor chicks are fed little bits and pieces of trash to their parents. No, parents are feeding condor chicks trash, and they're doing so probably because condors have a behavior of feeding small bits and pieces of bone and shell to their chicks. And so the bone and shell is providing a calcium supplement to this chick that's growing from the size of, essentially a goose egg to a full-grown condor over a 6-month period. So that's lots of bone growth. And so that calcium is really important to the chicks as they grow. But condors can't distinguish between, bits and pieces of glass and bits and pieces of plastic and bits and pieces of bone or shell. So we do find bits and pieces of bone and shell in the nest, but it's oftentimes with all these little trash items. We've termed that micro trash. The condor chick gobbles that down, and it's able to tolerate a fair amount of it, but at some point it can create an impaction inside the chick's gut, which then prevents the chick from growing. Eventually that chick would starve to death, but we'll go in and clean trash items out of the nest. We've even gone in and found chicks with impactions and brought them from the nest to zoos, removed the impaction surgically, sewed the chick back up, put the chick, or give the chick a bit of a strong antibiotic, put the chick back in the nest, and after that's over about a 24-hour period, the chick will start being cared for by its parents almost immediately after being returned to the nest. So where we once thought condors are incredibly sensitive to disturbance, they're in fact incredibly tolerant, and we're really, really fortunate for that because we wouldn't be able to do these types of activities to help them along the way. Another aspect of our nest program is putting condor cameras in the nest, and we started to do this as a way to monitor nests without having to go into the nest as often. So we can check on the chick's growth and its development and to see if there's any trash items in there without having to climb into the nest and actually give the chick a physical exam, which is safer for everybody. It means not having to, hang off a rope or going down a cliff, and then also the handling process of the chick is, there's sort of dangers associated with that. And so that's given us sort of the ability to get these incredible insights into sort of condor nests and condor nesting behavior that we wouldn't have otherwise seen. Unfortunately, I was unable to work or get PowerPoint to make some videos work. So I'm just going to say you can see condor nests. There are nests that are streaming live. So you could go home tonight and see what's happening in the condor nest. I think the current live streaming nest is actually in this one. This is up in Big Sur, and it's in a redwood cavity. But usually there's also the Cornell Lab of Ornithology also streams a nest from the Ventura, Santa Barbara area. On Facebook, the Condor Cave is a Facebook page that will also share lots of clips and lots of little condor tidbits. So if you're interested in seeing those videos, I encourage you to check out any one of these sites. But more importantly, sorry, you guys, you watching condor nests is not the most important thing, but most importantly, what it's meant is, so sort of pre-nest management, we had very, very low nesting success. And post-nest management, we've had some years not the greatest. Those are actually issues more with hatching than with actually once the chick survived. But we've started fledging many, many more chicks, actually anywhere from 5 to 10 times as many chicks as we did previous to our nest management. So prior to going in and doing all of that nest management work, monitoring the nests, we had 2 chicks total over a 5-year period, and now we've fledged, a number of chicks that it now makes up about a quarter of the population total. So that's 25, 30 chicks total in just Southern California. Okay, the title of my talk was Stories of Life, Death, Community, and Hope. So I think I've covered life, condors just doing their thing, death, what's killing condors, community, the group of folks out there doing the work to try to save the condors. And also the condors are sort of a community in themselves because of how social they are, but hope. So the researchers that work with our program have really helped us sort of refine what we are doing to protect condors. And condors, as the population has grown, the numbers have gotten so large that it's much harder to manage, on an individual condor basis. So we've got to be smarter about the resources that we have, because we don't have the Condor program is a well-funded program, but even still, we have a limited amount of resources. And at one time, look at like what the Yurok is now. There were 11 condors in the flock, so you had lots of resources to manage those 11 condors. And now, in Southern California, we're approaching 100 condors in the flock. We haven't gotten 10 times the amount of resources, so we need to decide where we get the most bang for our buck. And so the way that we're figuring this out is really through the research that's being done by the folks from UC Santa Cruz, University of Montana, the Peregrine Fund, a sort of conglomeration of researchers and academics helping with this. And that's to develop a population viability model for condors. And in and of itself, a population management model is basically we look at what's happening in the population. We monitor and we make decisions on how to deal with threats with our actions. And it's sort of this cyclical model. It's iterative, right? So we see what's happening. We use that to model what's going to the trajectory moving forward. We sort of tweak the dials, looking at the different variables that might influence, whether the population is going to grow or shrink. And then we try those things out, and then we see, was the model correct? Okay, if it was, great, we continue moving forward. If it wasn't, we adjust the model, and we keep going around and around in this way. And it gives us this insight into how better to manage the condor populations, how to be better shepherds and get beyond just the number of condors where we're at now, but get back into those thousands of condors which we're seeking. Basically, how to do that is we take existing data. This is for the entire California population, the southern flock and the central flock. But this is all data that was existed, and so we trained a model based on that. And so the dots are actually the number of the actual numbers, right? Like that we had of the population each year. And then the model, here's the best fit model, and then you sort of have a confidence intervals around that. And so we were able to sort of create a model that was able to predict, based on a variety of variables, what happened. So we predicted the past. Not really, that impressive because we know what happened in the past, but we can use those same variables to predict the future, right? So now we have these past numbers, and we can say, like, well, assuming we continue on doing the same things, what will happen to the condor population? And lo and behold, it will grow, right? And so, great, we can continue doing the same things, but we don't have the resources to do everything. So we can start looking at questions like, how are we going to make the condor grow faster, or the condor populations grow faster? Is it through something like nest management, or is it through something like releasing captive birds? And so, ultimately, this is the decision about where we're going to allocate resources. And so, what that model allows us to do is we can say, look, here's a situation where we're doing both. Here's a situation where we're just releasing condors. And here's a situation where we're not doing, we're just doing nest management. And here's a situation where we're not doing either. So we can see where we're getting much more bang for our buck. So now we have this ability to sort of look at where our resources go. And I would love to continue to do everything. But really what it comes down to is we need to make decisions about where we can really get the most out of the resources that we have. And that's through a population viability model like this, which gives me hope, right? It gives me sort of the idea of we're going to transition from managing individuals and ensuring the survival of every individual, and shifting that to, is the population able to persist into the future? And that is really sort of the last step needed to recover the condor and sort of get it across the finish line, where we can grow these numbers up to that point where we have a population that's able to sort of sustain itself, getting back to that sort of case-selected, survival strategy. So I just want to acknowledge, I stopped doing condor fieldwork in 2019. There is a amazing team of biologists and folks from the Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge and the Santa Barbara Zoo that continue to do that work. These are at least some of them really incredible. It was a nerve-wracking thing to leave a program that you spent a decade and a half pouring your heart and soul into, and these folks have continued on doing that. I also really want to acknowledge, you guys saw a lot of really amazing condor photos in this presentation. I did not take most of them, especially, I took many of them when they were from the nests. It's easy to take good photos of condors when you're at their nest, right? They're just there. But there's a gentleman named Tim Huntington, who's he's actually employed by the Ventana Wildlife Society up in Big Sur. Incredible photographer. I encourage all of you to check out his work at WebNectar. I think it's just webnectar.com or WebNectar. I think it's on Instagram. The guy is just phenomenal. He's an incredible photographer. So I really want to thank him. I thank Tim for using or for allowing me to use his photos. Questions? That's one of Tim's photos too.
Sustainable population number, and what is the range you're shooting for?
Yeah, so I didn't give, I sort of decided, I was thinking about this presentation and getting into policy and endangered species recovery goals is not as entertaining, I think, as just sharing amazing photos of condors and whatnot. So, but the current condor recovery plan has a goal for delisting, but it hasn't identified the goal for downlisting. And so condors are currently listed as endangered. Delisting would mean going from endangered to threatened, and then downlisting would mean from threatened to, you're just, you're no longer listed. We haven't officially established what that downlisting goal is. I personally think that condors need numbers probably an order of magnitude larger than where they're at now in the wild. Meaning, so there's about between 300 and 400 condors in the wild. I think we're really talking about 3,000 to 4,000 condors to actually have a population that can, deal with stochastic effects and deal with things that are that are going to allow them to sort of stay steady and not sort of decline. Some of that, we did do some homework to try to figure that out, and some of that is based off of Andean condors. So Andean condors are currently listed by IUCN, which is sort of the international organization that determines whether species are threatened and endangered. So Andean condors are listed as near threatened, and so they have a population of about 10,000. But if you look at that population and you compare the geographic range in which they're inhabiting, it's bigger than what California condors are currently inhabiting. But if you look at those population densities and you sort of draw it out to where condors are likely to inhabit, so maybe Oregon, California, Arizona, Utah, down into Mexico, I think that the population would be somewhere around, at the same densities as a near threatened Andean population, you would have around 3,000 to 4,000 condors. Yeah?
It said one egg swap up there, and I was just wondering what that is.
At one time, we, in the condor program, if we went into a nest and we found a a nest that was infertile, or an egg that was infertile, we would take a fertile egg from the zoo and replace it to allow that pair to raise a chick, and hopefully that chick would fledge in the wild. One of the things that the Condor model that we've done early on is that's probably not the best. If we're talking about how to get to condor surviving into the wild, the condor chick has a much higher chance of surviving in captivity than it does through that same period of time in the nest. And so while we used to do egg swapping, it's something that we've sort of have shied away from, because that egg, that fertile egg, if we raise it in captivity and release it into the wild, is going to produce a condor and get it past a stage where the chances of survival are lower than, once it's released as a juvenile. So, yeah.
With a population of only 21, 22, I forget exactly what you said.
Yeah.
There's not a whole lot of genetics.
Yeah.
How do you see that affecting the long-term viability of the species that you are doing this breeding?
Yeah. Inbreeding affects different species differently. So so to say, so I'm just sort of using that to caveat what I'll share next. So I'm going to share some comparisons to humans with condors. And so when those 22 individuals were brought into the captivity, they started looking at the genetics. Like, genetics was a big concern for the Condor program. Like, does that bottleneck can you get back from that? And so there's two ways that we can look at that. We can look at sort of, okay, who's related to who, and how much genetic diversity do we have? And so it turned out that those 22 individuals, there were 13 different clades, or sort of family lines within those 22 individuals. And those 13 different family lines have about the same genetic diversity as European humans. So cool, right? But you can't really compare humans to condors to see how susceptible, they are to inbreeding, right? Or to fitness deterioration from inbreeding. And so the other way that we can do that is just sort of look for deleterious phenotypes through, as you sort of breed condors. And so far, we've identified one. It's called, it sounds like condor, but it's not. It's chondrodystrophy. And so this is a recessive allele that when you have two carriers breed, they produce an egg, and the chick it's sort of dwarfed, and it's just not viable. It's not unable to produce an active chick. And so, I asked this of the geneticists. I was like, well, if we've identified this allele, why don't we breed it out of the population? And their response was, in doing that, we would lose other genetic variability that would be probably more deleterious than just having that one phenotype in the population. So far, and condors are long-lived, so it's not like we're very far into the sort of the number of generations since they were down to that 22. But we're, I think, into like the maybe F2 or F3 generation, and so far we haven't seen a whole lot of additional, really any major consequences from the inbreeding that certainly has happened. The population is managed genetically. We look at the birds produced in captivity each year, and we do we look at sort of what genetic lines that they represent, and then we release them based on where those lines are needed in wild populations. So we sort of assess the wild population, sort of where they are lacking in particular condor genetics, and we take those individuals from captivity and put the individuals that have those genetics into those populations. So we're definitely trying to maximize the genetics of each population. I think
Has there been, or would there ever be some sort of outlawing of the lead in bullets?
yes, and actually it's a little more nuanced than just like a downright outlaw. But in California, there is a law. I think the most recent of which is AB 711, Assembly Bill 711, which prohibits the use of lead ammunition for the take of wildlife in the entire state. So that's a fancy way of saying you can still buy lead bullets, but you're not allowed to shoot those bullets at wild animals. And so while that is certainly one way to go about affecting change, hunting and ranching people, I hunt, and I have lots of friends who also are hunters. They tend to be more sort of the libertarian mindset, right? They tend not to like to be legislated on, and so from my perspective, we might have been a bit premature in passing a law. We maybe could have done better to get them to buy in and to get them to understand the need, because when we passed the law, which there was actually two. There was also the Pedro Nava bill, the Pedro Nava Condor Protection Act, I think it was called, which was in 7/11 was fully enacted in 2019, I want to say, and then Pedro Nava was, I think, in 2011, if I'm getting my dates right. Don't quote me on those, but those bills definitely, there was a knee-jerk reaction from the hunting and ranching communities, mostly the hunting community, being like, "This is all junk science," right? And so you had like the NRA saying this is a backhanded way of trying to take our rights away and outlaw hunting. And look, I mean, like shaking your head, like, knowing what I know about condors and lead, it does sound ridiculous, but they don't know that. And so they are often a group of people who certain groups of people have it out for, right? And some of the sponsors of those bills, right? It wasn't the Condor program really pushing this legislation. In fact, we couldn't, right? I'm a federal employee. I cannot lobby for legislation in the states. It's illegal. But some of the groups that were behind that were known anti-hunting organizations. And so, while the skepticism was not well placed for condors, I think I can at least see why they would have that reaction. And again, it's sort of, that perspective, what I get at, it's like, do we need to, or should we vilify hunters, or should we identify them as the solution? And I think the way to get people to not use non-lead is to say you are the solution, not to say you are the bad guys. And so a lot of the Condor program, like I said, is doing outreach to that community, and some of that outreach was stifled slightly in because of the legislation. But what we found is, in Arizona and Utah, there is no legislation. In California, there is. Both populations still are dealing with lead. So, there's not yet a total solution yet. I think some of that will come with a generational norm shift, right? So, like waterfowl hunting, when they shifted from lead to non-lead, I think the big thing was, like, you talk to a waterfowl hunter now and they're like, yeah, it's just normal. We just use steel or tungsten. We use some other shot that's not lead. And I think that's what needs to happen. So it's going to take time. The other thing that people ask, and I'll just sort of answer that related to this, is folks will often ask, like, well, have we seen anything good in regard to the legislation? So there are some silver linings. One, the legislation created a market for non-lead, a foreshore So if I'm part of the ammunition industry, I now know I can produce non-lead ammo, and there's going to be a group of people that are sort of legislated to have to buy it. So that's definitely a plus for the legislation. But within the condor population, while we have seen the decrease in lead exposures that we wanted, what we have seen is condors, while over the time that we've had this legislation implemented, condors have become less and less reliant on the carcasses that we're providing them, and more reliant on the carcasses that are just out there. So inherently, those carcasses are a more risky food source. The food source, the carcasses that we're getting them, we know didn't have lead in it. So inherently, it's a more risky food source. So over a time period where we would have expected an increase of lead exposure, we've seen lead exposure stay the same. And so that's a positive, you know, so it's not the solution. Lead is still a problem and it's still the leading cause of death for condors, but at least it's sort of showing that like maybe we're starting to round that curve and we're getting to where we need to go. Go for it.
Yeah, I was curious about the decision in the early 80s. You said it was controversial to
Yeah.
take the condors into captivity.
Yeah.
I was thinking about, early 80s, people aren't on Nextdoor regularly. Would the government agencies, if they were put in that position to make that decision today, do you think they would be able to, or do you think public perception would, are there any examples, I guess, of that happening modernly?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about examples. You know, I'm thinking like maybe the Hawaiian Islands. There's a crow out there. I think it's the Alea crow that may do that. I think that's a really interesting question, and of course I don't know.
It was a great decision.
Yeah. You know, I mean, one thing I will say is we have the hindsight of a program like the Condor program that gives, you know, maybe a little more confidence to government agencies to make those decisions. It's a decision that is, I mean, it's a heavy one, right? To sort of say like this species can't persist without it being, you know, really taken from its natural environment. And there's, I think, you know, really, you know, the hope is, and I think that we've come a long way with the Endangered Species Act in identifying like what is the point of actually being endangered, right? Like condors are probably endangered, and we should have been doing things for them, you know, in the 1900s, right? And instead we were probably doing things that were really harmful for condors, right? Like people will also ask like what caused the decline, and I don't think the same problems that condors are they're facing today, like some of them might be the problems that helped cause the decline or that contributed to the decline. But there are other things like, you know, our government poisoned predators across the landscape. It was a campaign to reduce the number of predators so that we could have cattle and livestock and feed our population. Well, terrestrial predators find carcasses way less often than avian predators. So condors were almost certainly finding those poisoned carcasses that we were dumping out for, you know, to kill off predators way more often, and I'm sure that contributed to the decline of condors. You know, other things, use of DDT, right, like that causing eggshell thinning. You know, condors certainly suffered from that. They continue to suffer from that. You know, the sea lions that breed here on the Channel Islands migrate north. You know, the Channel Islands being a Monsanto Superfund site, and you know, become contaminated, travel north, and then end up dying and washing up on the shorelines of Big Sur. Condors feeding on those carcasses still contaminated, right? And still have eggshells that are 30% thinner than the condors in Southern California, which don't feed on sea lions. So, yeah.
They were a Superfund site?
Well, so Monsanto, right? There was a corporation back, I believe, the 60s and 70s. I do not know this history well. Say again? Oh, sorry. Thank you. Montrose. Monsanto is I'm going to get myself in trouble. This is streaming. Montrose, excuse me. Yeah, so the Montrose Superfund site. So Montrose was, they made pesticides. And one of the pesticides that was commonly used in the 60s and 70s, Rachel Carson wrote a book about. It was an organochlorine called DDT. And so DDT is a bioaccumulating toxin that will work its way up into the food chain and cause eggshell thinning in birds. And so the Channel Island bald eagle suffered from eggshell thinning as a result. Condors, peregrine falcon, the brown pelican. Many of those species are bouncing back because I believe it was in the late 70s we banned the use of DDT. A bunch of that DDT was just dumped into the Los Angeles Sound, or you know, out into the ocean, which is now slowly leaking and still sort of poisoning the environment. And so there's been a long effort to try to deal with that issue, and it's a very difficult one because it's toxins in the bottom of the ocean that are, I don't know. I don't know what engineer has figured out that problem, how to fix that problem.
So we're going out in the water and stuff and all the toxic stuff out there. I would have thought it was down toward Palos Verdes or.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but it's everything is sort of connected. Yeah, and I surf from out in the ocean. I don't know that humans are being impacted by DDTs in the same way that they are. Like, it really has to. The way it's exposing animals is working its way through the food chain, and so condors are feeding on the top of the food chain when they're from the top of the food chain when they're feeding on sea lions. So sea lions have an incredible concentration of that organochlorine.
I noticed on one of your graphs where you're showing before you have intervened, and then afterwards, the successive release.
Yeah.
In 2018, it seemed higher, and then it went down.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's sort of, again, it's a product of what is causing the growth, right? What is causing the growth of condor populations? There's been a couple of things that happened sort of in, I believe it was 2018, and then again just last year, that has really sort of meant that the population has sort of hit a little bit of a plateau. In 2018, was it the Dolan fire up in Big Sur? Massive fire raged through the Big Sur area and was responsible for the death of, I want to say, like 12 condors. And so it turns out, like 12 condors, when there's only 300 of them in the wild and you're releasing them, is a pretty significant bump. And so the population probably would have grown by 12 condors that year, and instead it just basically stayed flat.
It seemed like it was higher in 2018.
So and then dropped,
And
right?
then it dropped.
Yeah.
Okay,
So I think that's like that might just be the where the numbers were. We used first year, the start of the year number each year. So it's like there's a bit of a shift. But then in 2023, we had highly pathogenic avian influenza, which killed 20 condors, and like that's a significant portion of the population. So without that population, it was flatlined, but without that 22, the condor would have grown the population would have grown by 22.
Was that the same flu that affected all the chickens and everything?
Yeah, it is.
Is it eradicated or what?
No, it is very much not eradicated. So in the condor population, we're not sure how it's. We are actually working really closely with USDA and veterinarian, like lots of incredible virologists, veterinarians, to truly try to understand like how likely is it for condors to be exposed? Because we know that when condors are exposed, condors being really social, it can pass back and forth pretty quick. But we don't know how often or how likely it is for condors to be exposed. So it may be that they might get exposed once every decade, and so you lose 20 condors once every decade. Like that's a bummer, but that's not maybe a huge impediment that the population can't overcome. If it was one, I think we've done with the PVM, we've sort of modeled that, and really they could probably sustain exposures up to once probably every 3 years, but more frequent than that. Now we're going to really have problems maintaining a condor population, even with all the effort that we're doing. So there's also an experimental vaccine being worked on for condors, but because it's influenza, we all know, humans, there's the flu vaccine, and we know that the flu vaccine, because of influenza being it can change a lot, that it's not like the silver bullet that like polio vaccine was, that we can just eliminate that disease with just one campaign to vaccinate everyone. Like, yeah, influenza is just a different type of virus, and so it makes it a trickier one to deal with. So far, it seems like avian influenza is probably not likely to, pathways of exposure. It's really being sort of, in wild populations, it's being sort of, it has sort of refuge, the virus does, in waterfowl populations. And condors aren't interacting with waterfowl populations all that often, so it's probably a fairly low chance of condors becoming exposed. This one instance, though, knows that when condors do get exposed, we have to take action really fast to quarantine and try to protect the population from rapid exposure. And so that's something that the new team of biologists that are working within the Condor programs is something that I'm super proud of them. They have come up with pretty incredible plans to react and to sort of deal with those exposure events if they happen. I think you've had your hand up for a while. So.
I was curious, just with so many in captivity, have you noticed any changes in their behavior when they go into the wild?
Yeah, it was a big issue. It was a really big concern early on, and so they brought all these condors into captivity, and then they were like, we've removed the wild from the condors, right? And so it was really difficult for them to go out and then we started releasing condors, and the first condors we released were juvenile, were young, inexperienced condors, and there were behavioral problems. Like they were like, these condors are not behaving the way those condors we were. I think the analogy is Lord of the Flies, right? So if we took a bunch of kindergartners and we put them into a grocery store and expected them to behave like adults in a grocery store, we would be crazy. And that's what we did with condors when we started releasing them into the wild. And so fortunately, as condors have aged, there's been a lot of that sort of innate behavior that's taken over. And a lot of that has to do with the drive to reproduce. And so, that social structure started, as condors matured, they started becoming focused on, reproduction and started nesting. And then we got some condors with actual, sort of more typical adult condor behavior. And then, people will still say, well, condors interact with people more than they should and whatnot. And I don't know that that's a product of condors being in captivity so much as there's just being more humans in the environment for condors to interact with. Because if we look at other similar species like black vultures, for example, they have a lot of those similar traits where they will go in and start ripping apart people's backyards or decks or that sort of thing. And I think that's just a trait of the species. There's this innate curiosity and willingness to explore their environment. And so, they're doing what condors do in a world that's sort of new and different and has a different set of cues to respond from.
What's the life expectancy typical?
We think, so in the wild now, condors, it's a little depressing, but in the wild now, juvenile condors have about a 50% chance to make it to adulthood. So that's you're half of the condors that are hatched or released into the wild are dying before they reach 7 years of age. So life expectancy just from that is, it's a lot lower. In captivity, condors are, I think an Andean condor has lived into its 90s at a zoo in captivity. I wouldn't be surprised if California condors could do something similar. Like I said, the oldest known condor is 52 or 53 years old and he's a male, still incredibly reproductive, still reproducing, still, really doesn't show a whole lot of signs of aging. There's some other condors in captivity that are, have gone into a more sort of geriatric care, if you will. And then unfortunately, the oldest condors in the wild are dying well before they're reaching old age. They're dying from lead or other reasons for the most part. The longest lived condor in the wild, so that's not necessarily the oldest condor, but the condor that spent the most time in the wild, is probably Condor 98, and he was released as a 1 or 2 year old in 1993, I want to say, and so he's still alive today. So he's been out there for 30 some years.
How many of them are tagged?
All of them.
All.
Yeah. So when you only have 100 condors in the wild, you want to, and this is something that we're dealing with. Is like, at what point do we start saying we only need to sample the population to get an understanding of what's happening with them? When you had 20, to know them, to know what's going on, you want to really have them all tagged. I think we'll probably still have the goal of trying to tag condors into the, I think we'll probably get to, in individual populations, 150, 200 condors before we're saying, like, we're just not going to tag any. But we're working on it. We're working on, like, now that we have all these condors tagged, we can take subsets of tagged condors and see, run a model on that subset to see if what they're doing is indicative of the rest of the birds. So that's how we'll inform, when we can start sort of not tagging as many. I know it's 8:40. I can sit here all night and talk about condors, obviously. I love it, but I do want to respect everyone's time. I think we were supposed to end at 8:30, so maybe I'll hang out for a little while longer if people have questions. You can come up and ask, but I don't know if we have to leave. Or we have to